Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Dr. Hamid Sayed from the CMH Institute of Medical Sciences, Multan. And today my topic of discussion in this blackboard presentation is going to be the gross appearance and the main sulci and gyri which are present on the external surfaces of the cerebral hemispheres. So starting this topic, right now in front of you I have a view of the cerebral hemisphere of the right side. On the left is the lateral view, and on the right side is the medial view of the right cerebral hemisphere. So please follow my cursor over here. As you can see that on the left side, which is the lateral view, the surface has no distinct feature other than, of course, the sulci and gyri which we are about to draw. Whereas when we look at the medial surface or aspect of the cerebral hemisphere, the first most striking feature that we see is this C-shaped structure. This is actually a sagittal section of the corpus callosum. We talked about that before. It's the greatest commissure of the brain. That is the bundle of nerve fibers which connects both the cerebral hemispheres together. So this corpus callosum, it appears as a C-shaped structure in the sagittal section. The parts of the corpus callosum are: anteriorly, the bend is known as the genu, which bends downwards as the rostrum, which literally means beak. So this pointed part bending downwards anteriorly is the rostrum, and then the bigger curve you see on the anterior end is the genu. This here is the body of the corpus callosum, and the posterior turn or bend is known as the splenium. So these are the parts of the corpus callosum. Now let's come to the sulci and the gyri. There are 4 main sulci on the cerebral hemispheres. The sulci are the fissures, and the 4 main ones are the ones which divide the cerebral hemispheres into lobes. So the 4 main sulci, these are the central sulcus, the second one is the lateral circus, the third one is the Parietaloccipital Circus, so I'm just going to write O here for occipital, and then the calcarine circus. So these are the 4 sulci which are the main ones, because they define the boundaries of the lobes of the cerebral hemispheres. So let's look at the central sulcus. Where is it present? I'm going to use the color blue for that one. So the central sulcus, let's come to the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. It begins as an indentation on the supromedial margin of the hemisphere. This is the supromedial margin because it is present superiorly and on the medial surface. About 1 centimeter behind the midpoint of this margin, about 1 centimeter behind the midpoint, this central sulcus begins as an indentation, which you can see over here in blue. This sulcus or fissure then continues onto the lateral aspect of the hemisphere, going downwards and forwards. So this is the central sulcus. The importance of this central sulcus is that the area of the cerebral cortex just anterior to it is known as the precentral gyrus. Gyrus, as I told you before, is the fold, the prominent fold of the gray cortex. So the precentral gyrus is this area which I'm going to show you as a dotted area just in front of this central sulcus. This precentral gyrus is the part which is the motor cortex. That means it is responsible for giving the motor commands to the opposite side of the body. The part of the cortex which is present just posterior to, that is behind the central sulcus, is known as the postcentral gyrus. And this is the sensory cortex, that is, it is receiving information from the opposite side of the body. So let's just label this central sulcus so we don't forget that this here was the central sulcus, and the gyrus in front of it is the pre-central gyrus, right? The pre-central gyrus, whereas the gyrus behind it is the post-central gyrus. Okay, so now that we've looked at the central sulcus, now let's come to the other important sulcus on the cerebral hemispheres, which is the lateral one. So for that, let's go for another color. Let's go for pink. The lateral sulcus, let's see over here, begins on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. This is the stem of the lateral sulcus. This then continues onto the lateral surface, and as it enters the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere, it immediately divides into three branches, also known as the rami. One is the anterior horizontal ramus, and the other one is the anterior ascending ramus, and the third one is actually the continuation of the stem itself, known as the posterior ramus. So I'm going to label these three rami. On the medial surface, remember, is the stem of the lateral sulcus, so I'm going to just label this as the lateral sulcus. And on the lateral surface, you can see this is its ramus, which is the anterior horizontal ramus. The one which is ascending upwards is the anterior ascending ramus, and the main continuation, which is the posterior ramus, remember, this is also called the lateral sulcus interchangeably. So when we say lateral sulcus, generally we mean its posterior ramus. Okay, so this was the second main sulcus on the cerebral hemispheres. Now let's come to the third one, which is the Parietaloccipital Circus. So going for red, we can see this circus, the Parietaloccipital Circus, is the one which begins on the superlateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere, about 5 centimeters anterior to the occipital pole. So this here is the occipital pole, and about 5 centimeters anterior to it is the Parietaloccipital Circus, which begins as an indentation on this supromedial border. Now let's follow it on the medial aspect of the hemisphere. On the medial aspect of the hemisphere, this Parietaloccipital Circus is going to pass downwards and anteriorly, like so. So this is the Parietaloccipital Circus. Okay, the Parietaloccipital Circus. Now the fourth one, which is the prominent one, is the calcarine circus. So let's go for yellow over here. The yellow color is going to represent the calcarine circus. This is found on the medial surface of the hemisphere. The calcarine circus begins below the posterior end of the corpus callosum, which was also known as, I told you before, the splenium of the corpus callosum. So beneath its posterior end of corpus callosum, that is the splenium, the calcarine circus begins, and then it ascends upwards. About halfway along its pathway, it meets the Parietaloccipital Circus at an acute angle, and then it continues to the occipital pole. Let's just rub that. Okay, So we can see that this yellow line is representing the calcarine circus. This is the calcarine circus. So now that we've drawn the four, let's just do a quick recap. There are four main sulci or fissures on the cerebral hemispheres, which are the central. The central one is shown in blue, which you can see as an indentation on the medial surface, about 1 centimeter behind the midpoint of the supromedial margin. It continues on the lateral surface downwards and forwards, and stops just stops short of this lateral circus, leaving the narrow bridge of cortex between the two. This central circus is the most prominent circus, which is descending in this direction on the lateral surface. So you can easily locate it. You can easily see it when you look at the dissected specimens. The significance of central circus is that the part in front of it is the precentral gyrus, which is the motor cortex, and behind it is the postcentral gyrus, which is the sensory cortex. The second prominent circus is the lateral circus, which begins on the medial surface. The stem begins, and then on the lateral surface it divides into the three rami, which are anterior horizontal, anterior ascending, and the continuation, that is the posterior ramus. The Parietaloccipital Circus is the one which begins as an indentation on the supralateral surface about 5 centimeters in front of the occipital pole, and then it continues on the medial surface downwards and forwards. The calcarine circus is the fourth significant circus, which begins beneath the splenium of the corpus callosum, and then it ascends and meets the occipital pole, and during its pathway it also connects with the parieto-occipital circus. The significance of these four sulci in determining the lobes or the major subdivisions of the cerebral hemispheres are as such that the region of the cerebral hemisphere that is anterior to the central sulcus and superior to the lateral circus, this part is known as, this region, the whole of it is known as the frontal lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. And the part which is behind the central sulcus and superior to the lateral circus, this is known as the parietal lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. The part of the cerebral hemisphere which is beneath the lateral circus is called the temporal lobe. And the fourth one, which is the occipital lobe, is the part which is behind the parieto-occipital circus. So these are the four lobes: the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, and the occipital. These four lobes are the arbitrary divisions which we have defined on the basis of these four main sulci. So keep in mind there are also many other sulci present on the surfaces of the cerebral hemispheres, but these are the four most prominent ones. They can be easily located, and they are the basis of the division of the cerebral hemispheres into these four lobes, which also have a difference in function. If you would want to simplify that, then we could say that the frontal lobe is primarily the motor cortex concerned with the movements of the body, whereas the parietal lobe is, this part is the sensory cortex, which is collecting the sensory information from the body and integrating that information. The temporal lobe is considered with the processing of auditory information, and the occipital lobe, present posteriorly, is the part which is concerned with the visual impulses and the integration of that information. So this is how we could summarize the functions of these lobes. Thank you.